Well, happy Monday morning. Chris here with another episode of Rugby Ascendant. Well, how do we get the week started? Well, let's see. With a Times article chronicling the best all-time rugby coaches. And in this article from the Times, Stephen Jones and former England fly half Stuart Barnes list their all-time best rugby coaches. And on that list, now, before I address that, let me point out here that this is what I would say is an unbiased view, as you're going to see something happening in this video that you'll almost never see happen for me. And that is, I will, number one, speak well of the All Blacks. So, no, don't pass out, don't fall out of your chair. I'm saying something good about the All Blacks. Those who know me know that I'm not a fan of the All Blacks. Springboks all the way, Eagles after that. But the All Blacks somewhere way, way down the list. So not an All Blacks fan, and I've not been a big fan of Steve Hansen. But I do respect his performance as a coach and his accomplishments. So that said, I consider this to be an unbiased view. However, I do have to call into question Stephen Jones and Stuart Barnes' objectivity when it comes to ranking coaches. Jones lists Hansen as only the fifth greatest rugby coach in the modern era. Barnes puts him at second, so a bit more fair and objective. But let's look at what Steve Hansen has accomplished as the All Blacks coach. This is not a comprehensive list, just a list of some of the things he did as the head coach for the All Blacks. Remember, he was an assistant for several years prior to this with the All Blacks. But as the All Blacks coach from 2012 to 2019 through the Rugby World Cup in Japan, his record as the head coach was 93 wins, 4 ties or draws, and 10 losses. I didn't make a mistake there. Let me say that again. 93 wins, 4 draws, and just 10 losses for an 87% win percentage. That's an astounding accomplishment for a national side. His All Blacks team scored 3,852 points while conceding only 1,736 points, nearly twice as many points as it conceded. As a head coach, he won the Rugby World Cup in 2015, arguably a team that shouldn't have won that World Cup. A Springboks team, yeah, here's the bias coming in. A Springboks team that should have won. Yes, I know they lost to Japan in the pool stage, but no. Anyway. And if it hadn't been them, perhaps it would have been someone else. But the All Blacks did win that World Cup in 2015 under Steve Hansen. The Rugby Championship, 6 times under Steve Hansen, the All Blacks won it. Steve Hansen, World Rugby Coach of the Year, 6 consecutive years. Yes, I didn't stumble there. 6 consecutive years selected as the Coach of the Year by World Rugby. Now here is the real proof in the pudding. When it comes to test matches, Hansen and the All Blacks beat the Springboks 16 of the 19 games they played them. They beat England 6 of 8 games. They beat France all 10 times that they played France under Steve Hansen. They beat Ireland 7 of 9 times, and they beat the Wallabies 18 of 23 times. No one can match that record, and it seems unlikely that many countries will ever come that close. In addition to that, in 2013, the All Blacks went 14-0, the first team in the professional era to ever go undefeated. Truly amazing. And they had the 8-team match unbeaten streak. So Cyprus technically has the record for the longest winning streak in World Rugby, but they only played teams in Europe, and so their 24-game streak has a little asterisk next to it. In the modern era, the 2 teams that have that record are England under Eddie Jones and the All Blacks, 18-game unbeaten streak. That ended November 2016. Now, perhaps they penalized Steve Hansen for his record coaching Wales as a national coach from 2002 to 2004. He did not have a very impressive record with a sad Welsh side, winning just 10 of 30 matches with a 10-20 record. But I don't think that's fair. I think the measure of the man as far as being the best rugby coach of all time, I'm not saying he is the best rugby coach of all time, but I am saying that ranking him 5th, that just doesn't pass the common sense test. It doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't appear to be particularly objective. As I said, Stuart Barnes was a bit fairer when he placed him 2nd all time. But let's hear a few of the reasons that came into play here in this article that the Times published. The reason I'm talking about this is that the Kiwis have taken umbrage with this assessment. And again, I actually do love New Zealand, aside from the fact that, well, let me park my nuclear-powered carrier there. Aside from that, I do love New Zealand. But I am not an All Blacks fan, and certainly not a Steve Hansen fan. And my issue with Steve Hansen is, before I talk about the article again, is his love affair with Pacific Islands and his focus on providing support to Pacific Island nations when it comes to helping the minnows in World Rugby. He neglects the US, Romania, Germany, Hong Kong, Georgia, other countries that have potential to go far in rugby. And he does so by promoting the islands. Not a surprise, a lot of All Blacks players come from Pacific Islands. So not a shocker there. All right, so back to the story. And here we go. This is from the Times, and this is what Steven Jones had to say about Hansen. He may have run out of steam at the end, but he has been bold and imaginative. Until recently, he had kept New Zealand ahead of the pack, hardly ever bothered with what others thought, and was the best way to play and won so many games in such style. Well, that sounds very complimentary, but how do you rank the man fifth as one of the greatest all-time rugby coaches in rugby union? It doesn't match where you rank the fellow. So there you have it. That's a little bit odd in my mind. Now, for his part, Stuart Barnes, who was more generous and ranked him as the second greatest rugby coach in the modern era, had this to say. From 2013 to 2016, he coached the greatest team of them all. Now, that is hard to argue with. Folks, that is a difficult admission for a Springboks fan to say. Yes, but I'll say that again. From 2013 to 2016, he coached the greatest team of them all. It's hard to big up on the Kiwi coaches because the players arrived so well prepared. But Hansen took them to a whole other level from 2011 World Cup winners that Graham Henry steered. Hansen, the number 2, stepped up and became one of the great number 1s. Well, both of them seem to be penalizing Steve Hansen for having taken over a great team. But plenty of coaches in the history of sports have taken over great teams only to crash and burn and lead them in the wrong direction for a variety of reasons. Either the coaching style, talent left, the team had reached its apex and there was only one direction to go. But Hansen not only took a top team, the number 1 team in the world, but he kept them there for year after year. The All Blacks were like 9 years consecutive, unbroken streak as the number 1 team ranked in the world in World Rugby rankings. Well, we can argue about the quality of those rankings. That's a separate issue. But they were nonetheless, under the system that exists, the top team for an unimaginable period of time under Steve Hansen. It is amazing what has happened with him. So they punish him for that. Back to what Steven Jones had to say. Jones said, with regard to his number 1 pick, and he picked Sir Clive Woodward, the England and British, Irish, and Lions coach, as the top coach of all time. And he said, Sir Clive picked up a team with no infrastructure that was going nowhere. Hansen picked up an All Blacks team when they were already world champions. Well, there you go. Gosh, so if the measure of the best coach of all time is simply taking a team that has nothing and turning it into something, as opposed to taking a great team and making it the greatest team, perhaps Eddie Jones should have the number 1 billing. After all, Eddie Jones has coached countless national sides and raised their standard of play and took them from nowhere. He's coached Australia. He's coached Japan and made them an international competitor. And England took them on a long unbeaten streak and moved them up in the rankings to number 2 and took them to the Rugby World Cup final. So perhaps Eddie Jones should be number 1. No, Eddie Jones is not the greatest coach of all time, but he is an incredible coach nonetheless. And at the end of the day, perhaps one day he shall be considered the greatest of all time. Again, I'm not lobbying for Steve Hansen to be considered the greatest of all time, but frankly, 5th place, that cannot be remotely objective. 2nd place, a little more realistic. But very quickly here, a couple mentions. Steven Jones has Woodward at 1. He has Warren Gatland at number 2. While I respect Warren Gatland as a great coach, his accomplishments don't really bear out in number 2 ranking. Sir Ian McGeehan at number 3, Mark McCall at 4, Steve Hansen at 5. And at number 10, Steven Jones has Rassie Erasmus listed there. Now that I can go along with. Stuart Barnes has Carwyn James, Steve Hansen, Clive Woodward, and Rassie Erasmus at 4, Warren Gatland at 5. Rassie Erasmus at 4, that's a bit of a surprise for me. Listen, I'm a huge Rassie Erasmus fan. But honestly, I'm not entirely convinced that Rassie ranks that high, even with his other coaching experience. Had he stuck with the Springboks for another 5 or 6 years instead of just taking to the World Cup and then bowing out, we might be talking about Rassie Erasmus as the greatest coach in the modern era. But we're not. But nonetheless, I think that's kind. Listing him at 4, listing the top 10 is certainly warranted. Eddie Jones should be in both lists in the top 10, but appears in just one at number 10. And there you have it. That is Rugby Ascendant for today. Taking a little umbrage with Steven Jones and former England fly half Stuart Barnes and their assessment of who the greatest rugby coaches of all time are. Steve Hansen, not in your top 1 or 2 or 3. Not buying that, folks. There you have it. Not an All Blacks fan, a considered objective opinion. Take care. See you next time on Rugby Ascendant.